This program is made possible by the loyal financial support of the friends and partners of Family Policy Institute.
Good evening and welcome to Watchmen on the Wall. Thank you for joining us. It's my great privilege to invite to the studio Katie Modrau, the leader of the A21 campaign in the Western Cape. Katie, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you lead the A21 campaign, which is an organization that helps women out of trafficking situations and abuse situations. So we've spoken to you about a year and a half ago on this show, and I think maybe it would be good if you could just explain what A21 campaign does in South Africa.
Fantastic. So we are a global anti-human trafficking organization. We don't just work with women, but with men as well. Any victim of human trafficking, or what we like to call modern day slavery. What we do is we work largely at prevention, so preventing trafficking from happening by raising awareness in very vulnerable groups of people within South Africa. And then we also work at protection, so protecting victims who are identified, helping to connect them to services that are available to them in the Western Cape or around the rest of the country, making sure their rights are protected, that they're looked after, and basically walking a journey of restoration with them until complete independence and healing again.
Yeah.
I want to say that.
It's amazing ministry. You guys actually go out with law enforcement and rescue women out of trafficking situations.
That's correct. We offer a support to law enforcement or the Hawks when they are, doing raids or assisting victims in trafficking. We help to screen victims to identify are they victims of trafficking or not, and then offer comfort and support, and then show them to safe houses or safe places, whatever they may need. So we're a support. We don't initiate or do any of that on our own. We offer support services.
Now, trafficking in South Africa, most of it is linked to prostitution, sex trafficking. I know there's trafficking for exploitation, labor exploitation and all that. But would you agree that most of the trafficking in South Africa situation is for sexual exploitation?
I think that's the most common one and the most seen in terms of what the public understands. To really fully be able to say it's the most common, we'd need proper statistics, which we don't have yet because we don't have a promulgated law yet. But definitely the one that is, most prominent to the eye is sex trafficking. Yes.
Yeah. So talking about that law, now the Anti-Trafficking Bill, there's a long name for it, but we'll just call it the Anti-Trafficking Bill.
Perfect.
Was signed into law about a year and a half or 2 years ago by the president, but there has been some problems in implementation of that law. Where are we at with the Anti-Trafficking Bill?
So where we are right now is every government department has to declare their state of readiness. How ready are they to actually enact or fulfill their responsibilities that's written out in the law, or they're mandated to within this new law. So every department has to get themselves ready, train internally, and make sure that they are actually able to carry out what they're mandated to.
Now, if I can just come in there's a number of departments that play a role in the implementation of this law. That's because right. It's quite complex.
Yes.
It's like the Department of Home Affairs with the visa and immigration issues, it's social development, it's the Department of Justice. All of these things have to be put in place before this legislation becomes effective.
Yes, exactly. And it's natural for it to take a period of time, because the last thing you would want is a law that's signed into place and no department is capacitated to be able to deal with that. That would be detrimental. It's just taken a very long time since the act was signed till its activation date or promulgation.
Now, we did a lot of work prior to the 2010 World Cup event in South Africa. There was a lot of suspicion that trafficking was going to spike over that period of time, and that organizations were bringing young women into this country, moving them from rural areas into the cities because of the World Cup, and that many women would have been, and young girls would have been exploited during that. We did a lot of awareness campaigns. We worked with international organizations that came from America and France, and as a result of that work, we built a lot of awareness, and it helped. I don't think there was a lot of examples of prostitution, trafficking during the World Cup, and so we're really grateful for that.
Yeah, definitely.
But since that time till now, we're now in 2015, so it's about 5 years later, has trafficking or incidences of trafficking gone down? Has it plateaued? Is it still a huge problem for South Africa?
That's it's a very interesting question and quite a hard one to answer fully. I think when you look at some of the statistics that have come out in the TIP report this year, even some of the statistics, it seems like numbers are actually decreasing. But you've got to ask yourself, is that because the incidences are decreasing, or identification is just not happening? Identification of victims.
Right.
So I think there's a direct link between awareness raising and people knowing what they're looking for, knowing what trafficking looks like, and the identification of victims. If you don't know what you're looking for, the crime can happen in plain sight in front of your eyes and you won't know that it's happening. So definitely I think 2010 was marvelous because I think it put trafficking on the radar in South Africa. It opened government's ears and eyes, local societies' ears and eyes. But there's definitely a lot more work to do to make sure that we aren't letting this crime happen in plain sight, and really capacitating our social workers and our local SAPS members to identify trafficking and not pass it off for something else like prostitution or a drug addict or just a migrant who's in a rough work situation or whatever it may be.
So that's really our challenge here in South Africa, is keeping statistical evidence, having that at our... Because I remember when they were discussing the legislation in Parliament, nobody really knew how grave this problem was because there wasn't any evidence. Nobody's keeping stats, there's no research. So how do you really know how severe the problem is in South Africa? And we don't. And I think that's one of the challenges for you, for us, is to have proper statistical evidence so we can understand the problem or the weight of the problem. But you're also the chair of the Counter-Trafficking Coalition in the Western Cape.
Yeah.
So you're working with other organizations,
That's correct.
women that are running safe houses, helping women exit prostitution and trafficking issues. Is that growing? Is it working well?
It is. The Counter-Trafficking Coalition is very important work that we do and also so important for partnership. When you look at trafficking, it is such a complex crime. It's an organized crime. It's not opportunistic. There are so many aspects of it, which means that assisting a victim once they are rescued is complex as well. There are complexities to it, and you need many role players to assist in that. Also in the prevention of the crime, preventing vulnerable people from being trafficked, there's a lot at play in that. So there's many different organizations that need to be involved. So we feel that there is strength in partnership. Not every organization has to be excellent at everything. If I use your strength and you use your strength and this person use their strength, we really can combat this multifaceted crime. So yes, we're very proud of the work of the CTC, and we really value the relationship and partnership that we have.
Yeah, it's an very important point you make there, strength in partnerships.
Yeah.
Now, one of the key partners in this fight against trafficking and the abuse and exploitation of women is the church.
That's correct.
The Christian church. They play a huge role. So tell me, Katie, is the church helping? Are they coming to the party? Are they supporting and helping with this fight against trafficking?
I'd like to say yes. We definitely have seen an increase in support from the church, but there can always be more. And I think with that comes an understanding of what are the needs of victims of trafficking, or how can a church or a person get involved, in the fight against trafficking. One thing that has really come to mind lately is community and how important community is, especially with a victim of trafficking who's been rescued. Part of our work is that we help to reintegrate them back into society, being independent, holding a job, really having a positive environment around them.
That's right.
And the global reality is that 80% of victims will never be rescued. 80% of victims might be re-trafficked or vulnerable of being re-trafficked. So that speaks of the need of a very solid community. And that's where the church comes in, being able to accept these men and these women back into their society or into their community and support them on their road to restoration.
Yeah, that is such a tragic statistics that 80% go back into trafficking, or are trafficked or abused and exploited. And I think the church plays a huge role here, because if we can get them into the church and into programs and get good people around them and walk them out of this thing, that kind of stat could decrease.
Especially because when you look at human trafficking, it places a monetary value on a human life.
Right.
So ultimately it decreases their God-given value. You know, people are innately valuable because we are created in the image of God.
That's right.
As soon as you put a price on someone, you're telling them that they aren't valuable or they're only worth what someone will pay for them.
And it's amazing that the person itself feels that way. They feel like a commodity, devalued. And it's only that message that you just mentioned, that you created in the image of God, and that's where your value lies.
Exactly.
And only Christians can impart that value to that person.
And speak it back into their being once they have been through a tragic situation like this, so that they aren't in that vulnerable position. Well, I'm not valuable anyway, so may as well, you know?
Yeah, Katie, in the work we did prior to the 2010 World Cup, I spoke at a number of churches. I asked churches to ask people to get involved in this, to work with the groups that were already on the ground. And the question I always got was, but what can we do? This is such an organized crime. You've got these syndicates and gangs, and they even pay off officials. So how can we play a role? And then I look at you. I look at Katie Modrau. This, diminutive young lady making a huge impact because you're just doing something and you're driven by your conviction. So that means anybody can get involved in this fight, and there's something that God can use you to do to push back against human trafficking in South Africa.
Definitely. I think when you look at the statistics, it is overwhelming. And when you look at the fact it's an organized crime, it is overwhelming. Well, what can I do? Is it dangerous for my family or my children? Or, I've already got a full-time job. But I think the key is what do you have in your hand? And how can you use that? How do you turn your everyday life into something that's actually supporting and impacting others positively rather than impacting them negatively?
That's right.
So whether that means you can hold a fundraiser once a year, or you can have your eyes open and call in tip-offs when you see dodgy, if you want to call it dodgy, things happening on the street corners around you, when you see a child that looks like they're forced into prostitution, when you see what looks like forced labor going on in farms around you, how can you call that in and be a conscientious society member, if you want to call it that?
Yeah, there is a hotline.
There is a hotline number, yes.
People can call if they see anything suspicious in their communities.
Definitely. It's 0800 555 999, and that is a hotline that is monitored from within the Western Cape, but it runs nationally. Nationally, in every province. So if you can call that number, 0800 555 999, for questions, if you have any questions, or to call in tip-offs, or if you yourself are in trouble with what you think is trafficking, you can call that number.
Yeah, and if more people are aware and more people get involved around the country, we can break the back of this criminal syndicates that operate, some of them with impunity in this country, because we've seen reports, it's just because people are unaware, people are ignorant, and so they're able to grow and work and do what they do, sometimes in neighborhoods that one wouldn't expect.
Exactly.
They're operating there, renting houses, and so, just ordinary people looking out, being alert, and then calling that hotline is such a great help. Now, I remember also during the 2010 World Cup that there was a lot of fear about South Africa becoming what is the word when they bring them women in and take them out of the country, when they're trafficking women into South Africa?
Destination country. A
destination country. And because South Africa is the largest economic hub of Africa as a continent, a lot more prostitution, exploitation, and trafficking was happening in and out of our country. And it just makes, because they're bringing them out of poorer nations into South Africa, promising young women that you can have a great job in South Africa, and then finding out that they're prostituted and exploited. Is that still happening? Because the United States State Department has released their Global Trafficking in Persons report, and from that we see that South Africa is a second tier or tier 2 nation. We need to get to tier 1. Yes. And I want you to explain what the tiers mean. But I thought that, after 5 years of the anti-trafficking bill being implemented, that we'd at least get to tier 1. Yes. And we need to get there. So explain the difference between tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3.
Perfect. So I might not have the wording exactly correct, but basically a tier 1 country doesn't mean there's no trafficking at all happening in your country. It just means that your government is, or the government is taking very concerted efforts to make sure that they are combating trafficking and keeping it under control, keeping adequate statistics. So trafficking still happens, but the government is doing everything that they can and every year increasing what they're doing to prevent it and to protect victims. Tier 2 would be that there are concerted efforts, but more can be done and more should be done to protect victims of trafficking.
And that's where we are.
That's where we are right now. So we definitely can get to tier 1. There's many things we need to do to get there, but that we can. And then tier 3, there's a few levels of tier 3, but tier 3 is basically when your government isn't making concerted efforts, when they can do far more than what they're doing, and pretty much trafficking is running rife. You know, you can be on the tier 2 watch list, you can be on the tier 3 blacklist. There's many different levels within it, but ultimately you want to see that your government every year is not necessarily stepping up a tier, but moving towards stepping up a tier and increasing their efforts in what they're doing to combat and protect victims of trafficking.
Now, in your estimation, from 2010, the passing of the Anti-Trafficking Bill in South Africa and now the slow process of implementation, do you think we're working our way towards tier 1?
I think we definitely are. The fact that in 2013 the bill was signed, I think that's a definite positive step in the right direction. But we still have quite a few steps to take or quite a few things that we can do. And it's actually, if you read the TIP bill, it's recommended there what our country does need to do to get to tier 1. For example, actually promulgating the law, that's the biggest thing. Have it active. See prosecutions happening in the courtroom, seeing that there's actually statistics of traffickers being jailed, being prosecuted for what they're doing, and victims being assisted.
Are you aware of any cases that has been prosecuted in our law courts using the newly implemented bill?
Well, they can't use the bill yet because of the fact that it hasn't been dated. We have had a recent win in the courtroom in Port Shepstone, actually. Advocate Val Loughton, I think, was the advocate working on that case. And it was 2 women from Cape Town that were promised false jobs within the hotel sector, and they were taken up to Port Shepstone. They've actually just recently returned home, and their traffickers were fined quite heavily and jailed. But again, they didn't use the Trafficking in Persons Bill. They used aspects of it to
Sexual Offences Act.
Sexual Offence, POCO, that's the Organised Crime Act. They use many other acts, which debilitates, I think, our legal system with really getting adequate statistics. So I know that the State Department, US State Department, has said if we're getting prosecutions and wins in the courtroom, that's showing that the bill is effective or the law is effective, you're going to start moving forward.
And that's where we need to get, because, I've sat through the process of discussions on this bill in Parliament. And I know it's a comprehensive piece of legislation.
Very comprehensive.
It's going to, add teeth to law enforcement, and I think it's going to be a huge support base for people fighting this crime in South Africa, because it has everything there. But again, the challenge is the implementation in getting the different government departments, law enforcement, to understand the bill and the power it gives law enforcement and government to really crack down on trafficking in South Africa.
So the power that it gives law enforcement and our role players here, but also the protection it gives for victims. What we miss at the moment is often victims are seen as the criminal. They are the prostitute, they are the migration offender or the immigration offender, they are the refugee, they are the whatever they look like, they are the drug addict. So they are the criminal, not the victim. And what this law does is it protects them as a victim and places power in the law officials' hands to do something about it.
Yeah, it's amazing. And, Katie, we need to get more support behind organizations like yours, A21 Campaign and the Counter-Trafficking Coalition, because the more support, the more awareness, the more we can defeat this terrible crime in South Africa. I think it's just ignorance that is helping the criminal syndicates. People don't know about it. They don't know what to do about it. It helps them to operate with impunity. But we'll speak more after the break about the US report on trafficking, the global US report, and what South Africa can do to get to tier 1. Welcome back to the program. I'm speaking to Katie Modrau of the A21 Campaign about the recent US report on trafficking in persons. The US State Department has put out this global report. I think it's 188 countries, how they're doing fighting human trafficking around the globe. So Katie, we were talking about this issue. You said you have some of the suggestions the US State Department has made to help nations like us, South Africa, fight this thing more effectively. What are those?
Yeah, that's correct. So what's nice about the TIP report is that it really states what the state of government action is happening. It really focuses on what government is doing, and then it gives recommendations for how can you improve. What do they want to see in the next year before the new report comes out to see you move up a tier or improve, whatever that may be. So it's quite helpful. Some of the things that were outlined within the recommendations were a greater emphasis on labor trafficking. So as we were saying before, sex trafficking, I think, is what comes to mind when we speak of human trafficking. But we often push labor trafficking to the side. Now, we know within South Africa, we have a lot of farms, a lot of agriculture, a lot of fishing along our coastlines, and all of that contributes or makes people vulnerable, or our country a destination country for labor trafficking. Right. So a greater emphasis on that our Department of Labor officials are capacitated, that they know how to pick up what trafficking is and not just general exploitation of workers, but when trafficking has taken place, and how do they report that in. So that was quite a big recommendation, as well as prosecuting employers who do employ people in this way, if you want to say it, or do exploit people in this way, that they're actually seeing them getting fined and jailed for that. So that's one of them. We mentioned one before about investigating and prosecuting traffickers and making sure that they actually see jail time and see fines paid to really protect victims. And all of that plays into national statistics. It's when we often talk about human trafficking, we mentioned it earlier, there's not enough statistics. We don't really know what is the level of the crime here, or what is the state of South Africa within trafficking. And I know that if our country is more, is taking more care of taking statistics and really making those open to public, making those open to those of us working in the area, I know that would also move us forward in tiers, up to tier 1.
Yeah. Now, having said that, I remember in the work we were doing, we did some research and we spoke to law enforcement. And one of the things we discovered through our law courts is that a lot of the trafficking cases wasn't prosecuted as a trafficking case. It was prosecuted as something else. So the statistics doesn't show the high rate of trafficking because it said something else. Exactly. And that is one of the things that we have to get right in South Africa, to make sure that we understand what is a purely trafficking issue and what is, if it's something else. We have to prosecute it right, so then we can have the stats through our criminal justice system.
Exactly, and it all falls down to having the law, because if you don't have the law, when it's prosecuted in the court, it's, all the statistics are subsumed under kidnapping or rape or something to do with sexual offences, or, it's not classified as trafficking. And it's very hard to monitor what a country is doing if there's not accurate statistics, and it's very hard to improve if you don't know what your statistics are.
Correct, and that works against your work, and the work we're trying to do in building awareness is that we're saying there's, trafficking is a problem in South Africa, and it's a growing problem, especially if we ignore it. And then you get officials coming along and saying, how can it be a problem? There's only been 2 cases or 3 cases.
Exactly.
It isn't because there's been 2 or 3 cases, it's because we're not keeping proper statistics. That is the problem. And we can't convince people. I remember when I sat through the deliberations on the anti-trafficking bill in Parliament 2-3 years ago, that there was a certain member of Parliament on the Justice Portfolio Committee that actually said, we're wasting too much time on this bill. We're putting too much in it because trafficking is not such a big problem. So he was actually trying to undermine the bill. While there were all these organizations, and we played a big part in that, we were trying to put pressure on government to fast track the bill. And so we had young ladies dressed up with chains around them and makeup showing the abused, torn clothing, standing in front of Parliament, and the media taking pictures of that, trying to tell people this is what trafficking does to young women. And we need to fast track this bill. We need to implement it in South Africa before it's too late. There are syndicates operating.
Yes.
But because the statistics aren't there, there's a number of people that are skeptical in government, in the media, and they're saying we're just crying wolf. Are we crying wolf?
I don't think so. I don't believe we are crying wolf. No, it can really seem that way for the reasons that you've just explained. And then, you know, within the civil society sector, we do get labeled with crying sensationalism, or, you know, or fall into that trap of making things more hectic than what they are to actually get support. But statistics puts power in the hands of civil society. It also puts power in the hands of government to get the budget that is needed, to get the support that is needed, and also to see, you know, are we increasing in statistics? Are we decreasing? Are our efforts working, or are they not? So, you know, really, to see government really embracing that and not being afraid of sharing statistics, it can actually only take us forward and assist us. So that was quite a big recommendation that came there. Another one which is quite interesting is shelters and assistance for men and boys.
Very important.
Very, very important and very overlooked as well. There is one shelter within our country at the moment that takes men and boys in terms of for domestic violence or victims of trafficking. There's a few other places that we can use. But if you think about it in the whole country, and how big is labor trafficking, how many victims, male victims, are being used, where do we house them if they are rescued? Where do we support them? So, you know, this understanding that trafficking is not just for women and girls, yes, that is a massive, massive portion of trafficking, but we need to be able to support men and boys. They're used in sex trafficking too, not just in labor.
I remember Erin Giorgio of Joy Magazine, the publisher of Joy Magazine, telling me a story of driving around in Somerset West and seeing these men on the side of the street in winter being neglected, and heart broke for that. And she did some investigation to find places of shelter for them, and found that there was actually nothing. There's a lot for women. There are more and more being for women because people, you know, abused women, women at risk. So people understand that problem, and there's much being done about that, even in government. But they neglect that there are men and young boys also being exploited and abused on our streets, and there's nothing there for them. Is the report, the US report on trafficking in persons, are they making recommendations to South Africa that we should put more focus on protecting men and young boys as well?
Yes, at least having facilities available and the ability to assist victims of trafficking who are males. As you say, we have, I don't think enough, but we have adequate for now places for women, but not a lot for men. So I think that definitely needs to be a focus. And then again, that comes in with focusing on labor trafficking. So they all kind of interlink with one another, all these recommendations, you know? Yeah, so those are the major recommendations. I think the last one that was, or one of the other ones I'd like to highlight that was given, was actually modeling what we do here in Western Cape and what they do in KZN for our rapid response procedures, how we deal with victims. And that comes out of the CTC and then also the task team in KZN. Looking at modeling that in every province of how we actually assist victims quickly, that they don't have to wait 2 or 3 weeks to get access to services, but you utilize your civil society, you utilize them to mobilize the services immediately when the victims need it, and government really using that procedure. So that was quite exciting to see that they actually labelled Western Cape and KZN and said, look at that, look at how they're doing it, and try and model that. And that was one of the recommendations.
That's very encouraging. But essentially, Katie, what you're saying is that we're a tier 2 level country, and we want to get to tier 1. That's where we want to be, that we're aware of this thing, that our population is made aware, that our police and law enforcement is properly trained, that our court systems is jacked up on this issue, and that when they prosecute trafficking cases, that it goes down on the stats, so that people understand if it's a growing problem, if it's not a growing problem, we have proper stats to look to. But so, if I understand this, to take us from tier 2 to tier 1, what we need is the effective promulgation of this legislation. We've got the bill. We've got a comprehensive piece of legislation in South Africa. It gives teeth to our law enforcement, to our criminal justice system, but implementation, that's the issue. And that would get us to tier 1.
That's exactly it. Exactly it. Taking this promulgated law and implementing it effectively. All the other recommendations come under proper implementation of this law, which then again comes to support, budget, and capacitating the ground level workers who need to implement this bill.
That's my next question. So how does the ordinary public, Christians out there, citizens of South Africa that are concerned about young girls being sold on our streets? They don't want to see that happen. A lot of people are worried about children being lured into traffic situations and even forced labor. They want to do something about it. They want to see us move from tier 2 to tier 1, but what can they do?
That's a great question. I think you've really got to look at what do you, as I've said it before, what do you have in your hand to be able to do?
Yes.
Not everyone is called to go and start a new organization and do something like that, start a whole new thing in your area, but look at who is operational in your province, who is operational in your area, what are they doing, and how can you as a church or how can you as a person really get behind them.
That's right.
And really support the efforts that they're doing. That may mean eventually starting an organization, but it probably means getting behind their weekly activities, fundraising for them, advocating for them, and assisting them in what they're doing, and really strengthening, the action that they're taking.
Yeah, it's very important that you say that. I want to come in here and just say that there's a lot of people with good hearts, well-meaning people that want to get involved in this fight, and sometimes start a ministry or an initiative to get women off the streets and help them, but they don't have the proper training and understanding of the complexities of this problem. And it is a complex problem. It is a dangerous issue because of organized crime and gangs that control these women and young boys and young girls. And we don't want anybody just jumping into it. And that's why you're suggesting that people rather get behind the organizations that know what they're doing, are properly trained, like A21 and the coalition, Counter-Trafficking Coalition. And if you want to do something in your country, if you, in your city at least, if you're in Durban or Bloemfontein or Port Elizabeth, East London, and you want to know, okay, so we want to do something, I think the best thing is to contact A21 and Katie and say, okay, how do we go about it? And you give them proper advice and perhaps can tell them if there's an organization already operating in their city that they can get behind. Because that, if you strengthen organizations like A21 and others that's working around the country, that's how we become successful.
That's exactly it. We are not the only organization. Yes, we are one of them. Yes. And we form part of a network. So the Counter-Trafficking Coalition is the Western Cape network of part of the whole country. So, if you're not in Western Cape and you're somewhere else, we can give you connections to organizations in your area or close to your area, or sign you up with A21 and capacitate you with training material, information to be able to go and raise awareness. I think never underestimate the power of speaking up and raising awareness. One of the statistics that I know I've mentioned to you before is that 99% of victims will never be rescued. Victims of trafficking will never be rescued. Only 1% will be.
That is tragic.
It's a tragic statistic. And that's something that as a campaign, and I know as part of our coalition, really drives us. How do we get to people before they become part of that 99%? So how do we empower them with information of this is what trafficking looks like? No, it doesn't just happen in Europe, it happens here. This is how you may be lured or recruited, and this is how to protect yourself and others around you. Never underestimate the power of that. Yes. And it doesn't take much to be able to do that as your church. To support ministries already doing that, or even as an individual going into schools and doing that as well. So there's definitely very many ways for people to get involved and strengthen what is already happening on the ground.
This human slavery is so offensive to the Christian. I mean, our belief system is, we believe in Jesus, and he came to set us free, and he came to set all mankind free. And just the fact that, women, young girls are being sold into slavery, are being exploited like this should mobilize the Christian church in South Africa, because it's everything we believe, and we know that there's horrible crime against humanity, whether it's women or men or young boys. Slavery must be abolished, and the Christian church should be leading the charge against this. We should be helping, we should be building awareness, getting involved, getting behind organizations like yours, not complaining, but getting behind and doing something about it, because I just believe that, it is the church's role and primary responsibility to fight for justice. The God we serve, his throne is established on righteousness and justice. Exactly. And so the exploitation and slavery of women and men and boys and girls is it goes against everything we believe. So the next step then is getting information out, building awareness, because it's so important to build that awareness and keep that awareness. Just mention that call center number again, that people can call if they anywhere, in a shopping center, supermarket, in their neighborhood, they see something that is suspicious, don't say, maybe it isn't. Actually make the call. Is that what you encourage?
Definitely, make the call. It may or may not be trafficking, but what you do is you alert the police and you alert the investigative units to a potential hotspot, and they can definitely then do their follow-up and investigation. And if enough calls are coming in, you may think it's just you, but you don't know there may be 5 or 6 calls from a similar area. It really alerts the police to knowing, okay, they need to really be raiding or watching out for what's going on here.
That's right. Now, you know what is a frightening statistics, and I want our viewers to know that, because it's because of ignorance. It's because people just go on with their lives. They're looking the other way. And that's why we have this stat in South Africa, I believe. Annually, 66,000 women are raped and sexually abused in South Africa. We have one of the highest in the world. Sure. And those figures are not coming down. Now, what is frightening about that is only between 5 and 8% of these perpetrators are successfully prosecuted. That means up to 92% of rapists and abusers of women and young girls are walking free and can repeat their crime over and over again. That's where we stand in South Africa. And the reason, Katie, I believe that is happening is, again, because people are just not interested. Yeah. People are looking the other way, somebody else will do it. But if we can empower people and help make them aware about what is happening as far as the abuse of women and children is concerned, I think more people aware, more people phoning into police is going to help decrease these stats, because I'm ashamed to live in a country where women are abused. I mean, a nation is judged by the way it treats and looks after the most vulnerable members of a society. And as a nation, South Africa is not doing well currently. But as you say, we have lots of opportunities to get from tier 2 to tier 1. We can stop the trafficking, we can stop the exploitation, the abuse of women. We want women to live and walk freely in this nation, and we can play a big part on doing that. Mm-hmm. So Katie, I want to thank you for the incredible work you do. If people look at you walking down the street, they'll never know the amazing work you do to fight for the protection of men, women, girls and boys, for their dignity, fighting human trafficking, going out with law enforcement in raids and rescuing women. It's incredible, but I know it's your conviction that drives you. What is your final message to South Africans out there, to people, to the church, how they can help and support and get behind you? What is your plea?
I think I'm just going to echo exactly what you said there. We are our brother and sister's keeper. If we're not the ones making the call, if we're not the ones opening our eyes to what is around us, then who is going to do it? Jesus looked below the surface of what something looked like. May look like a refugee, may look like a drug addict, may look like a prostitute. Look below the surface, look deeper, and make those phone calls, call in if you see it, and reach out your hand to help. You probably find that it takes much less from you than what you think, and you would have a much greater impact in seeing our nation go forward, in seeing victims assisted, and really seeing a change within our country. So look below the surface, don't be afraid, reach out your hand and get involved.
A powerful and profound challenge from Katie Modrau from the A21 campaign. Look below the surface, reach out your hand and help get involved. Mr. John Jeffery, thank you for giving us your time, and for speaking to us on this anti-trafficking legislation. I've spoken in our previous segment to Katie Modrau, the leader of the A21 campaign, and we spoke about the global report by the United States State Department, where South Africa has been designated as a tier 2 country. Now, she's very confident that we can get to tier 1, but one of the problems was the anti-trafficking legislation that has not yet been promulgated. When is that going to be promulgated?
That has now come into effect. It came into effect on Sunday, August 9th. So it is now in effect. There are just 3 sections which are not in effect because the Home Affairs regulations have not been finalized. So it's 3 sections which are impacted on by that. But the rest of the Act is in effect.
Would you say most of the legislation is in effect now?
I can't remember how many sections there are in the Act, but there's a number. It's only 3 that are not.
Now, this obviously is good news. That's 9th of August is Women's Day. And so the president has promulgated the anti-trafficking legislation, which obviously gives a lot more teeth to law enforcement to fight the scourge of anti-trafficking in South Africa.
Yes, just to say that trafficking for sexual purposes has been a crime since, I think, 2007 with the Sexual Offences Act. Trafficking in children has been a crime with the Children's Act. What the Anti-Trafficking Act does is well, it contains it all in one act. It does tighten up crimes. It does increase the penalties, although the courts have been issuing fairly severe penalties for people found guilty of trafficking. And it does specifically provide for labor trafficking, which was the area that was not covered before.
But this is the most comprehensive piece of legislation when you're dealing specifically with the issue of human trafficking.
That's correct, yes.
And again, Katie Modrau of the A21 Campaign, who works with a coalition of organizations that's fighting human trafficking in South Africa. She's very excited about the legislation, but was unsure about the implementation. But now we've got the great news that on Women's Day, this legislation has been implemented. Parts of it, which is the Home Affairs, still needs to be tightened up, and that will be implemented soon, I imagine. And then the fight really begins. Now, the State Department report, the global report on human trafficking, as I said earlier, has designated South Africa a Tier 2 nation. But Katie is very confident that we can get to Tier 1. How do you think the implementation of this legislation is going to help us get there?
Well, I'm not sure the criteria that the U.S. State Department use for their tiers, but I would hope that the implementation of comprehensive anti-human trafficking legislation would move us into the best category.
Because that's where we want to be. South Africa being a country where they bring trafficking people into and taking out a destination country. So because of our economy, fairly strong economy compared to other states in Africa, the U.S. State Department and others have been very concerned about South Africa and that we need to up our game. And I think we did with this legislation, and it'll take us a little bit further. The training of law enforcement, how does that work? Are they properly trained now to begin to implement this act?
As far as I understand, and the same would go for prosecutors, it's the hawks who predominantly deal with investigations. So I would urge, one of the problems with trafficking is statistics are pretty minimal.
Yes.
And for example, in the US State Department report, there's sort of quite wide generalizations. They don't source where they get the information from. I would urge anyone who has information on trafficking, human trafficking, to report that to the law enforcement agencies, particularly the hawks.
On that question, Mr. Jeffery, a lot of people don't clearly understand what trafficking is. There's prostitution, there's coercion, there's all kinds of things, and even sexual abuse. And people don't know the distinction between trafficking, human trafficking, and just, maybe forced prostitution or whatever the case may be. Is there going to be some kind of education for the public on the issue of human trafficking to help them understand the issue firstly, and then how to report that because of the problem with statistics?
Yeah, I think that's something we need to look at tightening up because, when it comes to work, I presume most people probably don't want to do the work that they're doing, do it because they need to earn money. So that form of coercion is not enough. For trafficking, it's real coercion where the person has no choice, effectively is held a prisoner. And the example of human slavery is one that's used to explain trafficking, that the conditions that people are kept in is one of where they're very similar to what slaves were like in the past.
Yeah, and when I sat through the deliberations of the anti-trafficking legislation in Parliament, a couple of them, and I remember you were on the Justice Portfolio Committee doing a lot of great work on this piece of legislation, and I remember members of the committee, some of them weren't convinced that human trafficking was such a big issue in South Africa. And the reason for that is because we didn't have proper intelligence and statistics on this issue. For example, and Katie Modrau brought this up as well, a number of trafficking cases was tried as something else. So people didn't even realize this was an actual case of trafficking, human trafficking, rather than just maybe violence or coercion or whatever it was tried under. But now with the legislation being promulgated, do you think we will now see proper stats being recorded by government so that we understand the gravity of the problem?
Look, those stats have been there for sexual trafficking since 2007, and I think from around the same time for child trafficking. You know, one of the problems with the bill, it got introduced just before the World Cup, or South Africa was hosting the World Cup, and there was pressure on us to finalize the bill because there were accounts that there were going to be thousands of women and children trafficked. We didn't feel that we could do that in such a short space of time, so we rather called in the different law enforcement agencies to look at what their plans were for the World Cup, specifically regarding detecting and combating human trafficking. That included a toll-free number, and after the World Cup, we got them back to find out how they'd done. And they reported to us, and that includes the toll-free number, which we'd also checked as to whether it was working, that they hadn't detected any cases of trafficking relating to the World Cup. There had been some arrests in another town that wasn't a World Cup city, so it didn't necessarily appear that it was related. So that's the difficulty. It's easy to, you know, there's been an issue with, I think, Home Affairs saying that large numbers of children are being trafficked, and I think some of the NGOs disputing that. But I think that since those two acts came into effect, trafficking statistics have been recorded. And in fact, a recent case which went on appeal to the Cape High Court was of a forced marriage, the Xhosa custom of Ukutwala. And the person, I mean, the man had married a young woman, I think a girl, without her consent. Her parents' consent in terms of, or he felt it was the Ukutwala custom. That custom, though, does require the consent of the woman. And so he was found guilty of trafficking, and specifically. That was even before the act came into effect. So now I think that has changed, and obviously with the implementation of the act, things will be tighter. We obviously also need civil society organizations to monitor the implementation of the Act, and to check that it is put into full effect.
So, Mr. Jeffery, that is so important, the statistics that we need to keep, and also the call center. I think if we can encourage, and I'm sure government wants us to, encourage people out there to use that call number, if they see anything suspicious in their communities, to call the hotline and to report it, because that's another way we can begin to gather good statistics. But when I was in the deliberations, you know, I noticed that there was a lot of skepticism about human trafficking, and again, it's because of the lack of stats. And as we build up the stats, I suppose we can do a better job of fighting this crime. But just from your perspective, what is law enforcement telling you, the information coming across your desk? Is most of the trafficking labor trafficking, or is it sex trafficking? Where is the...
I mean, labor trafficking is going to be, well, is the one area that has no statistics because it wasn't a crime. So those statistics for labor trafficking will only start now. And then we will get a better sense of what is happening. I think it's going to be quite difficult because, you know, we are, particularly if it's people from outside South Africa. Look, you hear of cases of people being sent by families from the rural areas to the cities to work, and effectively the families receiving the money back home, and the person who's been sent to work not getting anything. So those kinds of cases would obviously be dealt with. Trafficking for labor purposes from other countries. We may have issues around how much was it trafficking, what was the consent of the person, did the person who was coming know what was going to be happening to them. Because we have had situations of people from neighboring countries being brought into the farms by labor brokers, particularly when there have been disputes with local people, not prepared to work for the wages that the farmers were offering.
So the fact that the legislation has now been promulgated by the President means that the fight against human trafficking is going to go up a notch.
Yes.
It's going to give teeth to law enforcement. It's going to help the NGOs, organizations like A21 that's fighting in this, working closely with government. So, Mr. Jeffery, I want to thank you for the great work. When you were on the Justice Portfolio Committee, the work you've done in tightening up this comprehensive piece of legislation called the Anti-Trafficking Bill, and for just congratulations that it is now promulgated, implemented, and we just wish government well in the fight against human trafficking, and we working with NGOs, we just believe that South Africa is going to get to tier 1 because that's our hope.
Okay, thanks very much, and it is a comprehensive bill, or act rather, and we want to see it working. So we're very much committed to ensuring that it does work.
That's our program for tonight. Thank you for joining us. Please visit our website at familypolicyinstitute.com and subscribe to my weekly newsletter. This is my primary method of communicating with you, so please subscribe today. If you have any comments or suggestions for the show, please write to us at info@familypolicyinstitute.com. We value your comments and your input. Please also remember that the latest edition of Joy magazine is now on sale in retail stores right across the country. Make sure you get your copy. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you for joining us tonight. God bless you, and remember to keep standing.